Well, good morning, good evening to folks out there. Welcome to our regularly scheduled live stream programming. Today we are going to, of course, explore some of the fascinating events going on in the Middle East. My name, of course, is Sandy Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. And I've got a couple upcoming events that I'm going to put on screen for you right now, just while I have your attention. And here they are. Next week on June 3rd, on Thursday at 10 o'clock, we, of course, have a really interesting conversation called Stopping the Next One, Wildlife and the Next Pandemic. This is going to feature two journalists. One is based in London and the other based in Nairobi. They have traveled the world to look at 6 different animals and 6 different potential viruses that could form the next pandemic. It's hard to think about a next pandemic given that we're not through this one, but they have a lot of interesting things to say and a lot of great visuals. So that's going to be a really good one. Then we're going to take a little bit of a break in our live stream programming. It is, becoming summertime and the weather's getting so much nicer and warmer. June 16th, though, on Wednesday at 11 o'clock, we will conclude our Russia disruption series with Vladimir Kara-Murza. This is an opposition figure in Russia who has been poisoned by the state twice and survived. He will be interviewed by Moscow's bureau chief for the New York Times, Anton Troyanovsky. Anton, if you haven't heard it, is on the New York Times daily podcast this morning talking about events in Belarus. He is a very interesting character himself. So that's going to be a good one. That's on June 16th. Then, of course, our Summer Institute for our high school and college students is June 21st to 25th. We're happy to have folks join that. And we have all kinds of things lined up for that, which we're very excited about. We'll be talking about an introduction to various languages and geopolitical and cultural discussions of those languages, amongst other things. And lastly, and this is not up on your screen, but we're currently planning for an in-person event. Wow, that seems strange to say, an in-person event for sometime in August. So stay tuned on that one. It should be a good one. So before we get to today's speaker, I want to just offer the following statement. Today's session follows some events and topics in the Middle East that can be highly divisive. As a reminder to our members, our audience, and our friends, we are a firmly nonpartisan organization, meaning we do not advocate for any political party, nor do we take policy positions on events in contested areas of the globe. Our role, as always, is to convene conversation and to do so by bringing you carefully vetted programs. The views of our speakers are their own and do not represent those of CIR. Some of these dialogues will be difficult, some will be very challenging, and some views aired may not match your own, but we hope they will inspire conversation and provide perspective. So with that said, let us move to today's speaker. Let me welcome Ronen Dangoor. Welcome, good evening.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So Ronen is a former deputy director of the research department at the Israeli Prime Minister's office, where he served for more than 20 years. He now works as a strategic advisor to companies in Israel and the EU, and writes for various think tanks and newspapers in Israel, mainly on issues related to nuclear strategy in the Middle East. And he lives in Tel Aviv, Israel, with his wife and 3 children. And Ronen, boy, a lot has been happening in the region recently, a lot. Can you start off by giving us your perspective on where things currently stand in Israel and the Gaza Strip? Both sides have claimed victory in the recent conflict. Can you help us understand what has happened, taking us a little bit behind the headlines?
Sure. And once again, I really appreciate being here. And thank you very much for Sandy and all the rest of the team. And just to emphasize what you said in the beginning, although I worked for many years in the Israeli government, I'm now not in a position of representing the government, and all of the analytic work that I do is my own perspective. So, this is my perspective and my analysis in this slideshow. And so let's move a little bit to what happened in the last 2 weeks in the region or in Israel. Right, so we have a conflict of 11 days, but actually it didn't start exactly in May. It started in April and then linger into May shooting. Hamas was in a position maybe to win the next Palestinian elections that was supposed to be holding place this year. But at the last minute, or during the month of April, there were many discussions with the Palestinian authorities, and they decided to cancel these elections. And Hamas was, of course, disappointment, but it took the advantage of the tension in Jerusalem and started some hostile activity against Israel. And the main source of it was Jerusalem tension, but the political aspiration of the Hamas was behind it, or the core reason for them to start this conflict. It actually wanted to gain this political leadership position, not through elections, but through their leading the military assault against Israel. And this is how it all started. We will refer later to the Iranian interest here. I'm not sure that the Iranians were behind it or were pushing directly to this conflict, but everything that surrounds it is actually coincide with their vision of how to confront Israel, how to press the Israeli public, and how to gain more and more support from the Palestinian people to the Hamas position. So even though the Iranians were not directly involved, it served their interest for sure. And lastly, I want to refer to the regional implications of this conflict. And actually what we're seeing in the last few years in the Middle East, in general terms, we see in Israel region, two main, I would say, camps. One is promoting economic or pragmatic development based on standards of living and economic ties. And that was the basis for the Abraham Accords that was signed between Israel and the Emirates and the Bahrain, Morocco. And this was also what Israel thought is maybe the basis for some kind of settlement with Hamas. And then the other camp is the more ideological camp, and acting in order to put chaos in the first camp. So what we're seeing here in this conflict is the second camp, the ideological camp, led by Hamas, have a lot of influence, of psychological influence, and destabilizing the region. And this struggle will continue in the next few years on the regional arena. So that's really in general what happens. I'm now broadcasting you live from Tel Aviv. There were a few times that we went to the shelters, but now everything is very quiet and all is back to its normal. Until next time, I guess.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Iron Dome, which I believe is what we're looking at in this photograph?
Sure. So this is actually the famous photograph from the last conflict. We see here on the right, Hamas rockets firing from Gaza Strip, and the other from the left, we see the Iron Dome rockets getting ready to hit Hamas rockets. The Iron Dome anti-missile system has a success rate of about 90%, which is quite good. And it intercepted about 1,400 rockets during the last conflict. It's been operational for the last 10 years. So it first came operational in 2011. And there is a huge US involvement or cooperation with Israel in the development and the production of the system. Over the course of this years, the US aid or finance 1.6 billion US dollars in the system, and also a large portion of the production of the component of this system is now being produced in the US. The US Army, as far as I know, have bought 2 batteries of the system 2 years ago, and now in the process of getting used to it or getting to know it and integrate it into the U.S. Army. So that's really in general. It's a unique system, one of its kind. The first system that can intercept short-range rockets. Very efficient, but I must be cautious here because it's very efficient against Hamas. Against Hezbollah, which has a much larger stock of rockets, much heavier and much more accurate, I'm not sure it's going to be such an efficient system.
Yeah, and
that's about the Iron Dome.
I heard yesterday that Hamas tends to build missiles that are fairly low quality. Is that an explainer for the success rate of the Iron Dome?
Yeah, well, they're building most of the rockets now inside the Gaza Strip. They used to smuggle most of them through the Sinai border, but not anymore. And now they're producing most of it in the Gaza Strip. And it might be primitive, it might be not so sophisticated, but it's very efficient. I mean, they managed to manufacture thousands of rockets, and now it's a threat that Israel will have to face in the coming years for sure.
Yeah. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Iran and their foreign policy, their ideology and roots, and really the core of their resistance to Israel. Where can you talk to that and where that comes from today?
Sure. Well, let's dive into a little bit about the Israeli-Iranian conflict in general terms. And just a reminder, this is Israel in here at this corner, at the orange corner, and then the green corner, or not the corner, it's half of the map, is Iran. As you can see, there is no mutual border. So the conflict is not about territory. It's about ideological difference and all kinds of interests, but it's not about area or about the border. The population, of course, Iran has 10 times more people than Israel, almost 10 times. And of course, the size of it. So it's not exactly as symmetric or equal in numbers. Iran regime from the revolution, top priority is survival, like many other regimes, by the way, Democrats or not Democrats. And nuclear deterrence is one of the key elements that they want to develop in order to serve this top priority target. The other thing that they want to keep is the Vayalati Faqih, which is the principle that the ruler of the country is a religious man or a very high rank religious man, a clergy. They want to have a regional influence. And I want to emphasize here that Iran does not have allies. They're not allies. They're either proxies or they're pushing somebody. They have a very special relationship with Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, but he's not really an ally in the sense that he can help Iran if Iran is in trouble inside Iran. So he only lends his facilities to Iranians, and Iran doesn't have an international ally as well. It's not like Israel that rely heavily on the US support. Mostly, we think of Iran as an aggressive partner or an aggressive country here, but they have a defensive strategy actually. So they want to keep away all their enemies as far as they can from their borders. In order to do that, they have an offensive tactics, of course, but in the region. But their defensive strategy is in the core of their vision, which is also it's actually what Israel is doing as well. Israel has also perceived itself as a defensive strategy oriented and the very offensive tactics sometimes in the region. And lastly, the main enemies are the US, the big Satan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and ISIS or other Sunni organizations. And you can see here in the picture, those are the four, and Israel is not at the top of the list, as far as I can understand. It's not Israel. I would say that the regime is indeed have extreme ideology, but it's very pragmatic conduct. And I have three examples over the course of the history of this regime. The first one is the end of the Iran-Iraq war. And then the leader Khomeini said, I have to drink from the cup of poison because I have no choice. We have to end this war. Too many Iranians are dying and they're hitting our cities with missiles. I have to do that. So it's a pragmatic. He once said, this is a war of God. And then he said, no, let's have some settlement with the Iraqis. The other one, when the Americans entered Baghdad or captured Saddam Hussein and so forth, the Iranians halted the Ahmad plan. Ahmad was the crash program that Iran had for producing nuclear weapon. And in 2003, they decided to halt this plan because of the outside pressure, because some of their activities were already exposed, and because of the American near their borders. And the third example, of course, is signing the JCPOA a few years ago. And as the current leader said, it was part of my vision as heroic flexibility. So he said, I have to be flexible here and I have to be brave together. And as you remember, they signed the agreement, although many doubt their intentions back then.
So should we turn?
The mastermind behind Iran policy, yeah, just to summarize this part. So the mastermind and I think the main figure, no doubt, is Ali Khamenei, the Iranian leader, since the late 80s until now. He's old, he might be sick, but he's still taking the decisions. And he is very rational, I would say, and has a very, very deep strategic thinking.
It's a great photo too. Well, can we turn to Israel's foreign policy with Iran and talk about Netanyahu's main objectives in dealing with Iran and why part of his policy has been so controversial?
Yeah, so let's move.
Oh, we can go through that if you like too.
Okay, so we can start here maybe, because this will lead us to Israel position as well. So what I said at the beginning of this discussion is why actually what's their policy towards Israel? I mean, we don't have a conflict of territory. What they want from us? Firstly, it was part of the essence of the revolutionary regime. I mean, this is one of the flags that they raised when they got to power in '79. Not only hating the Americans and attacking the Americans, but also hate Israel. Secondly, there are some religious argument in the Quran, which I'm not going to get into now, and it's also controversial. But anyway, they use those arguments in order to facilitate their vision. The other thing is very important to them, and they said as long as Israel control all of Jerusalem, we will have to change this situation. Of course, Israel has historic ties with the Shah, with the late Shah, with the former regime. And Iran was always, this regime was always concerned that the Shah supporters will come back. Israel-US alliance, as I said before, the US is the main threat to Iran, but Israel, of course, has as the representative maybe of the US interest in the region, as far as they see it, is also very, very important for them. And the Palestinians issue, which will enable them to present themselves as the leading power in the Muslim or the Arab world, because they take advantage of the anti-Israeli sentiment in the Arab world, and they said, okay, we will lead this camp. what their vision, how they want to get rid of Israel, actually. So they have an historic model, which is the Crusaders, who came to this region hundreds of years ago from Europe, supported by money from the outside, built fortress, but were forced, eventually they were forced to, they defeated and forced to go back to Europe. They want to attack Israel weak spots, as they call it, which is the economy and mostly the civil society. So they don't want a direct and full confrontation with the Israeli army, but they do want to destabilize the civil society. The Palestinians should be in the front of this conflict against Israel, not the Iranians, the Palestinians, like Hamas, as we speak before. And now they want the expansion of the Gaza model, meaning building organization with missile capabilities who can have terror attacks against Israel, and to expand this model to the West Bank. The last part is the one maybe most concerning, is surround Israel with missiles from the south, which is Hamas, from the east, which is Syria, maybe Iraq, and Iran, of course, and from the north, from Lebanon, from Hezbollah. And as I said before, West Bank is the next target for them. They have an official plan or an official vision, which they presented, and actually they try to act accordingly to this vision. So they have a plan for 2040, and the principle of that is oppose any Israeli-Palestinian political agreement. Of course, support terrorism, ongoing pressure, and psychological warfare against Israel's civil society. Support the one-state solution, meaning not to have a two-state solution, Israelis and Palestinians. And that will enable them to get advantage of the demographic effect. I mean, if the Palestinians will, and the Israelis or the Jews here will be in the one state, then of course, demographically, Palestinians will have the upper hand at the end of the day, or eventually. And they want to encourage Jewish immigration as well. And then, because the outside pressure and the international community will be fed up with this conflict, they said, okay, let's hold a referendum. And taking advantage of the demographic effect, as I said before, this will be the end of the Zionism, because the outcome of this referendum will actually be to form on all of the area, Palestine, and as it's written here, the final solution, resistance until referendum. So I want to talk about a little bit about the nuclear issue, and then move to Israel. Very, very short overview of Iranian nuclear program. So they have few activities until the revolutions, actually a lot of activity. The Shah was supported by many countries. But after Khomeini came to power, he actually freezed the program. During the Iran-Iraq war, there were renewed effort to build the nuclear capabilities. So they bought some capabilities from Pakistan, from AQ Khan network, and so on. I'm not going to get into details here. And then at the end of the 19th, they start a crash program, which called Ahmad. And it was with the accurate purpose to manufacture 5 nuclear warheads to make a test. It was like, this is the Manhattan Project of the Iranian side. But it only lasted for 5 years without, of course, completing the work. Ahmad was halted, as I said before, it is in its first phase in 2003. And then in 2009, after the discovery of the Fordow nuclear site, which was also clandestine enrichment site, they halted altogether, as far as I know. It doesn't mean that they don't want any nuclear weapon altogether, or at least the capabilities of producing it in the future. But the crash program that they had at the end of the 90s is no longer exist. And of course, 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, they signed the JCPOA. In the last 2 years, as you're well aware, they are violating the accords after the Trump administration decided to withdraw from the accord in May 2018. And the Iranians waited for 1 full year and then started to violating the accord. And now there is a negotiation, which we will refer later, to resume the JCPOA. Just very, very quickly about the regional threats from the missile, which is the main deterrence as far as they see it, like a military the area. It threatens US bases, military bases in the Gulf. They have an improved accuracy, psychological effect, and all of it is, or some of it operates by Iran proxies, like the Houthis in Yemen. So refer to your question now, let's move to the Israeli point of view or vision on Iran. And I must refer also to Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he is maybe the most important person who shaped Israeli policy in the last decade or more than that. So the Israeli government see Iran, of course, as existential threat on Israel. And that's a known fact. The government is focused on the nuclear conflict, but it has also very, very many concerns from the missiles and the terror activity as well. The purpose of the government is to isolate Iran and not give legitimacy to its regime. And if you sign an agreement with a regime like that, any kind of agreement, you kind of giving legitimate status to this regime. So this is one of the reasons why to object accords like JCPOA. And Israel in the last few years are attacking Iranian targets in Syria, as you are well aware. Israel wants to present at least that it has a credible option of a military attack against Iran. And this is also going on for at least a decade back, or at least, I don't know, 10, 12 years back. It wants a constant cognitive campaign, which I'll refer later, against Iran, in order that the international community and mainly the US administration will fight Iranians' development. Clandestine activity, of course. There are all kinds of rumors and publications about operations that were done in the last few years. People disappeared, bombs were blown, but I think the most impressive operation was the stealing of the nuclear archive in January 2018. That was something that heavily affects, I think, the Trump administration. And it also enabled researchers and the IAEA to get to know much more in details and the intimate details of the late Ahmad plan and the current Iran Foundation for its next move, if indeed it will get the decision that they want to develop a nuclear weapon, a decision that hasn't been made yet. Impose economic sanctions, of course, against Iran, and the long-term solution, at least as far as Netanyahu is concerned, and this is my impression and my analytic, only mine, he wants to have a US-led regime change in Iran. That's the solution. So he's like the neocons from Washington, but actually nowadays he's the last one standing. After John Bolton is home and Mike Pompeo is no longer Secretary of State, but he was actually, when he, I'm not sure if you remember, in 2002, he was appearing in Congress before the Iraq War in September 2002, and he was preaching, of course, for attacking Saddam and taking over Baghdad. But one of the reasons he advocated for that was he was thinking that once the US Army will capture Baghdad, it has a huge influence on destabilizing the Iranian regime. And that was his main point. He always saw the Iranian regime and not Saddam Hussein as the main threat to Israel. And I think he still is. This is his long-term solution or vision. If it was depend on him, this is what he wants to do in any shape or form. So that's my take on that. The narrative that that Netanyahu and the Israeli government on Iran is quite similar to what the Israeli government said on Iran 10 years ago. So it's an ongoing cognitive campaign. First, Iran is lying, which is true, but this is the first phrase. Secondly, Iran is almost at the point of no return, so we have to act now. We have to act now, and now is anytime. It was true 10 years ago, and it's true now. Iran, of course, is a terror state, another phrase, and supported Al-Qaeda. Iran missile, as I spoke before, is a threat to the region, is a threat to the EU. Israel is ready to attack. I said that before, that's another message. And the last message, we oppose the JCPOA, and I explained earlier the deep root for that. But also Israel is very concerned with the JCPOA with, I think, three major things. One is that there is the sunset clause. I mean, there is a date where this agreement is not ending completely, but Iran will be much more without any restrictions of developing more nuclear capabilities and enrich materials. The other thing is that Israel think that restrictions now are not enough, and that this agreement is not referred at all to the missiles threat and to Iran activity in the area. So it's a bad agreement also because of that.
So where do things stand right now between Israel and Iran?
So that's bring us actually to today and maybe for the next few months. I think now everybody is a little bit in a wait and see mode. The wait and see is referred to few things. First, Iran ambition, as they present it now, they want to be the same as Japan. So they want to have the Japanese nuclear model. The Japanese nuclear model is actually, we have enriched uranium, or we have fissile material, whatever, plutonium, but we're not using it in order to produce a bomb, okay? But I mean, the international community will give us the legitimacy to hold those materials and to hold those capabilities. Once we will have the decision, we can jump and we can run to the bomb or to produce it in a very short time, very short notice. But we want to hold a deterrence, actually, without producing the bomb, which is a very clever strategy. So they want to get to this position in the next 10 years or in the next 5 years. Now they're accelerating the development because they have the opportunity, because Trump administration decided to withdraw from the agreement. So that's the first thing. Missiles are the most pressing threat to Israel. What the Iranians are doing these years is they are changing, or they are developing old-fashioned missiles into accurate ones, and they're doing it all over the region. especially assisting Hezbollah and the Syrians, and maybe even Hamas in the future. So they are developing that. I think they're learning very carefully Israelis' anti-missile systems, like Iron Dome that we spoke about at the beginning of this discussion. They're learning their capability, and they're planning how to confront it better next time. I don't think Iran and Israel are aiming into any direct military confrontation between those two countries. So it's going to be not altogether under the radar or under the sea, because sometimes some activities are popping out, but it's a very isolated and small activity. It's not a full range military confrontation between the two countries. So I don't think it will change. Both countries are using all kinds of leverage, again, with the international community, and the Iranians are using, as I said before, proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and so on. Waiting for the next leader. This is actually true for both countries. Because as you know, we are here in Israel, we just 2 months after the 4th election in 2 years, and we're waiting for a new government, which I'm not sure if it's going to form and who is going to lead this government. But more importantly, maybe, is the next leader of Iran. They have a next month election, a presidential election, but the president is not the leader. He is running the government, and he's a very influential figure, but he's not taking the last decisions. This leader, as I said before, Ali Khamenei, he is the mastermind. And once he disappeared, things will be different. I'm not sure to which direction, but this is a waiting. This can be dramatic, as far as I know. They can also choose somebody who continue with the same line, but I'm not sure if it's going to be in the same rational thinking and deep thinking that Ali Khamenei has. I anticipate a return to the JCPOA in the next few weeks. I might be wrong, but I guess Biden administration is very eager to do that. The thinking, I think, in the administration now is, taking care of this issue with 3 main stages. First, let's go back. Let's go back to the agreement that we know, and so that Iran will halt all of this activities, that the development that it was carrying on in the last 2 years, which were very concerning. I mean, now they're enriching to 60% for the first time. So that's the first thing. Secondly, they want to try and to include some other issues in a new agreement, or at least they talk about that, and specifically the missile and the Iran regional activity. And lastly, I think they will refer to the sunset clause. I mean, when the agreement will be coming to its end in a few years' time. And it's actually what was done in many of the arm agreements or arm control agreement in the international community as well. You have an agreement. When it comes or close to its end, you renegotiate extension of it. This is what the US did with the USSR or with Russia. And these are most of the arm control agreement in the nuclear front as well. So I think the thinking here is, let's go back to the original agreement because we have no other choice and it's urgent. And we want to do that before the Iranian election for president in the next month. And then renegotiate to extend it and to include more issues inside the current agreement. So these are the main points that I think are or expected, but we have to be very cautious here because nobody can tell the next move of the Iranian leaders.
So let's talk about the JCPOA for another minute. If you were advising President Biden and Biden's administration on the JCPOA and U.S. position on that, what would you tell them?
It's a very personal assessment here, because there is a huge argument here on this agreement. Firstly, I think even the people, even John Kerry, who signed this agreement, agree that it's not a perfect one, and it lacked a lot of worrying signs and a lot of worrying development. It doesn't cover. But that was the best that it could do back then. And I think now the administration realized it has no choice in this short term to negotiate and sign new agreement. So the only choice that they have is either to sign their old agreement or to escalate, or to expect an escalate the situation now with an unknown development in the future. And also, the US is thinking about the implications of other countries in the region. Let's say the Saudis, okay, are very, very concerned from Iranian's nuclear developments. Once the Saudis discovered about Iran's development, they declared, and actually the Crown Prince declared that in his last US visit 2 years ago, that if Iran will get a nuclear bomb, Saudi Arabia will follow through. And this is a concern for the US, a huge concern for the US. And of course, the US has, I would say, negotiation with the Saudis about building a nuclear reactor and the term of it and so forth. So I would say to the Biden administration, maybe you have no choice, but you have to go as quickly as possible to the negotiation table in order not to abandon the missing point from the original agreement. Not taking, the Obama administration was working very hard on this agreement. But once it was signed, that's it. They left it. And I think it was a mistake.
Mm-hmm. Can we unshare the screen, or do you have more slides to show?
So just one optimistic one. Maybe I should screen that at the end, but I'll do that now. At the end of the day, I believe that the Israelis and the Iranians people have a lot in common. They both appreciate education, culture. They have a long and very, very old heritage. They're very proud people, and they used to have a very strong relationship, actually. So what is said here at the Hebrew sign here is this is a sign from, I don't know, 40 years ago or whatever, or 50 years ago, and it said in Tel Aviv, this is where the Iranian embassy in Israel will be open, here. So this is the sign. So I'm optimistic. I'm not saying that it's going to be short-term development, but in the long term, or maybe in a few decades, things will change.
Very good.
So I'm stop sharing.
Excellent. Yes. And there's a number of questions from the audience that build on your presentation, and thank you for that. I think the first two that I want to talk about are really kind of about dialogue and about countries talking. We know in international relations that there's always much more to the scene than we know. And so, question here from Steve Shore: does Israel have any back channel communication with Iran on any of these big issues?
I don't think so. I don't know, actually. And I don't think it's something. It doesn't make sense to me if they do. Israel is concentrating on speaking to other countries in the region who have a huge interest in this situation. Of course, all the Gulf states, and also to the US. I mean, these are the main two channels I think that Israel is working on.
A related question here from Catherine Jerison. The U.S. position that all of Iran's proxies, including Hamas, are terrorist groups seems to preclude diplomatic dialogue with the most direct participants in the conflicts. Do you see any path for a more comprehensive dialogue?
Well, there are two levels of dialogue. One is the strategic. I mean, do you change your vision? Can you have an agreement about recognizing Israel, whatever? This is not realistic. This is not something that we should aim for, because not that I don't want that, but I don't think it's visible. The other part is more pragmatic, short-term agreement, let's say even with Hamas. I mean, Israel, even not speaking directly with Hamas, but speaking to all kinds of mediators from Qatar, from Egypt, whatever, each and every ceasefire, and how to to reload oil, or even giving him money, the financial support through Qatari money. These kinds of arrangement are enable the the conflict to calm down a little bit until the next round. But it's not a strategic agreement. I don't believe it's possible for now, and I don't believe it's possible with other Iranian proxies. Although, of course, I'm not aware of the American diplomacy activity in the region.
Okay. Well, related question just in from Ken Apt. How likely is it that Bibi or his successor, should there ever be a successor, will continue this objective of having the United States implement or pursue a regime change in Iran?
Firstly, it's not a declared strategy. I mean, it's something hidden behind all kinds of things. And I guess if you ask Bibi directly, or the government of Israel, they will not necessarily agree to declare that officially. It's not an official policy. Not that it will object that, but I'm not sure it's a wise thing to say it. By the way, even in the Trump administration, where you have a few very strong neocons over there, especially Mike Pompeo, he was also very, very cautious of declaring that sentence altogether. I don't see a major changes in Israeli policy. I'm not referring only to this issue. I don't see a dramatic change in Israeli policy, even if a new government is formed in the next few weeks.
Well, let's talk about that new government for a second. I think one of the most startling little tidbits in reading about the recent conflict was that, the new government was 2 hours away from being formed, last Monday. And then, of course, everything broke out and that new government was not formed. And key to the new government was a coalition with some parties from the Palestinian area. Can you tell us the prospects for Bibi and his future, and the prospects for political change in Israel?
Okay, I'm less of a political analyst, but I can try here and share my view on that. So we're in a deadlock in the last 2 years, and it has many reasons for that. One of them is that few of the major parties in Israel refusing to be part of a government led by Netanyahu anymore, because of his ongoing or beginning of his trial here in Israel, and also because all of his conduct, or some part of it, very annoying for them. And by the way, some of these parties are really right-wing. They ideologically, they're no less right than his views as a right leader. So this is one deadlock. The other thing is that the Arab Israelis are now trying to shape themselves as a force that can be relevant for a government. The one who started that was Netanyahu himself. he realized that he cannot form a government without their support, also one of their parties. So he kind of, although unofficially, gave a um, legitimate action to these Arab parties to be part of the government. Now that his most right-wing parties are against the participations of Arab parties in his government, the Arabs are considering supporting the other side. But they will have to support one side or the other, because if not, we're going to have a fifth election. So my take on that, I'm not sure how it's going to end. I think more people are fed up with those elections, and some solutions will be made in the next few days or weeks, even if the next government will be another short-term government as well. But it can be historic, because this is after 12 years, consecutive years, there is a chance, the first realistic chance of Netanyahu stepping down.
And just super quickly on that comment, does that imply that the corruption trial and so on would proceed at a greater pace, or how does that affect Bibi's future should a new government
yeah, I'm not sure about the pace of the trial, but I think some of his defense or his status as a prime minister being a little bit more protected by this status is going to fade away once he will not be in this position. So he will be in a weaker spot once if I'm not sure if it's going to happen. If it's going to be somebody else who lead the government, it's a weaker point for him, and this is one of his main motivations to keep his position.
Last question about Bibi, and then we'll move on to some other territory. This is from Gabriella. Are the Israeli military and security bodies entirely behind his perspective on Iran, or are there other inputs?
Well, I would say I'm not sure, but from what I read in the papers here, and this is my only perspective, I think most of them are. They see the weakness of the JCPOA. Few years back, there was more opposition to his position. The most famous one was the internal argument between him and then Defense Ministry Barak and some of the heads of the security establishment here about whether to attack Iran. So they opposed it, and strongly opposed it, and maybe it was one of the reasons why it never got to operational level. And also, after the signing of the JCPOA agreement, some of the military leaders argue that it's not the best that we could achieve, but it's better than being without an agreement. Let's take it this way. The current head of chief of staff is, I think, totally in line with Netanyahu.
Well, carrying that forward, Israel, of course, has the nuclear bomb, has nuclear capabilities. How does that play out in terms of Israel's approach to the region, and how does that play out in terms of Iran's approach to Israel? Is that truly a deterrence, or how does nuclear capabilities in Israel affect a lot of these geopolitics?
Well, here I must say that I don't know if it's true, and I don't know how it's affect. There are all kinds of publications, but I don't have any knowledge about that. And I don't think it's effect. I don't think it has, it's just, all the discussion about Israel capabilities or special capabilities, if it exist or not, are not part of the discussion. I mean, maybe in the future, if and when Iran will get the bomb itself, there will be a more broadly discussion about Israeli capabilities. Of course, countries in the region are trying to raise this issue once in a while in the IAOA discussions or yearly discussions, but I don't think it's an issue that really affects now the development that we talked about before.
Okay. A couple questions here about Hamas in a little bit more detail. So we know that there haven't been, elections in Palestinian territory for a long time. Hamas has, the weapons on their side. Walk us a little bit through some of the politics and the governance and so on within and the role that Hamas plays.
So Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip through election, by the way, and then through, and then they have a constant conflict with the Palestinian authorities in the West Bank, or with Abu Mazen, which is affecting the Palestinians' position all the time. Abu Mazen position is, firstly, he's against the violent track. I mean, he's against terror. I'm not sure he's the leader who can lead the Palestinian authorities to a peaceful agreement or last agreement. But my take on that is that it was an opportunity to talk to someone who opposed violence and opposed terrorism. And it's too bad Israel didn't have enough courage or enough vision to talk to him and try to have some kind of interim settlement with him. He's losing his power gradually. I think maybe he was miscalculating the political situation in the West Bank, and that's why he declared about this supposedly upcoming election. By the way, I'm not sure that Hamas, if the election will be held now in the Gaza Strip or in all of the Palestinian territories, I'm not sure Hamas will be the number one or the leading. The problem was that inside the West Bank, there were actually three major parties who are not Hamas. So all the rest of the votes, what the danger that all the rest of the votes will be divided, between those three parties, and Hamas will come up as the biggest. But if it was only one party behind Abu Mazen, he might as well be the winner. Right now, they canceled the election, and Hamas took advantage of the situation in Jerusalem, and now psychologically, he kind of guarding the Jerusalem mosque. So he's gaining a lot of political power in the Palestinian territories.
Question here from Scott Bunton, one of our board members. He asks, Tom Friedman of the New York Times has made a strong case that conflict between Hamas and Israel is profoundly in Hamas's interest, in Netanyahu's political interest, and in Iran's interest, and that they're all very willing to pay the price of destruction. Do you agree with that assessment?
I agree. I totally agree that it's in Hamas and in Iran, as we talked before, interest. Totally. It served their interest. It served their long-term vision, as I presented earlier. Netanyahu, maybe he gained a little bit for the short term, but I don't think he gained a lot here. I'm not sure his image is improved. There was a lot of criticism against the police forces here inside Israel and all the internal unrest, which was more worrying phenomenon than the Hamas missiles. There is a lot of criticism against his policy of providing financial aid to Hamas. So, and I don't think that it will completely destroy the chances of a new government to be formed. Not at all. This chance is still very much alive, and we will see how it unfolds in the next few days. So it's a mixed answer to this complex question.
Complicated question. And I guess a follow-up on that, which is a difficult follow-up, but I'll ask it nonetheless. Is there a solution that will bring at least a long-term and relatively stable cessation of conflict, if not long-term and relatively stable peace? You're not the first person in the world who's been asked that question, but what are you looking forward? What are some of the options worth exploring and discussing in looking for something a little bit more long-term?
Yeah, well, I will divide that into two. Firstly, what is the solution to the Gaza situation or to Hamas behavior? And here you can take three major venues. One is that stop supporting Hamas and aim for the Palestinian authorities, to Abu Mazen or his successor, to take over. I'm not sure if we can assist that or not, but at least if there is a partner to Israel, it's Abu Mazen, it's not Hamas. So this is the first alternative. The second one is continue as it is now, the same, not support Hamas, but to have some kind of a tactical agreement with him, arrangement that will enable a few years of quiet until the next round. And the last one is of course a huge military operation in Gaza Strip in order to destroy all of Hamas infrastructure, whatever. This is very, very costly, and politically, I don't see any government will take this decision in the near future. In the West Bank, that's another question. There's all kinds of suggestions. I'm in a position now that I don't see any solution for the short term. I think both sides will have to keep in mind that there is going to be a solution in the long term. So not change too much on the ground that will enable us in the future to have some kind of a settlement, because I still believe that the Palestinians should have some kind of independent, territory, a state, autonomy, whatever. But I don't see both sides now ready for a real negotiation. Not at the moment, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah. Well, one question I often like to end our streams on is around optimism. Obviously, we've talked about a lot of very challenging subjects today, but is there anything that gives you some optimism or hope for things playing out in a more constructive, stable, peace-oriented manner in the region? Anything that you kind of hold on to as something that might bloom into a flower down the road?
I think two things. One is that at least for the last decade or so, there was a lot of disruptions, a lot of people got killed, but every time I think there is a chance that next conflict will be shorter and less people will be killed or less casualties, because this is not in the interest of any side. I'll take the situation with Hezbollah, for example. For the last 15 years, there was a very quiet border between us and Hezbollah since the last war in 2006. So that's more on the tactical issue. On the much more broader, as I said before, I think there is a struggle now between two major camps. One is the pragmatic or more economically oriented camp, and the other one is the ideological camp. I'll take an example from the French Revolution. They said then that once there was a possibility of a real, freedom, then the people who never got used to that, got very, very angry because they suddenly realized of the opportunity. And this is, I think, what happened here inside Israel or in the territories. Now, suddenly, some of the people said, hey, we have an opportunity to prosper. We have an opportunity to be equal. But we are so far away from it, then we express our frustration in violent way. I believe that as time goes on, those people, the ideological camp, will realize the benefits of the economic prosper. Not to say that emotions will not be an important part of this region. They will always be emotional and religious, of course. But I'm optimistic that the rational, economic, pragmatic camp will prevail.
Well, Ronen Dangoor, thank you so much for a fantastic review of an incredibly complex situation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure and honor to be here.
And our door is always open. Should you be over on this side of the pond, we would love to host you and hear more of your thoughts on how all of this is going to continue to evolve.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. And folks, we will see you next Thursday at 10 a.m. where we're going to get into the next pandemic. Really looking forward to that one. And in the meanwhile, I hope you all have a fantastic day, and bye-bye.